I was mowing the lawn, sweating under the late afternoon sun, when I first realized I'd been watched. Not in the way a neighbor notices another neighbor. More like someone noticing details that only matter if they actually care. I glanced up at the windowsill of the house next door and caught her there. Miss Callahan. 52, maybe a little older, hair streaked with silver, she didn't try to hide. Eyes sharp as broken glass, but warm at the corners. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and I could feel the weight of her gaze before I even met it. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand and tried to focus on the rhythmic thrum of the mower. She called out then, her voice cutting through the hum. Mitch. That was all, just my name. But there was something in the way she said it that made me freeze, one hand gripping the mower handle a little too tightly. Yeah. I stammered. She didn't smile, not immediately. Instead, she pushed the screen door open, letting it slam softly behind her, and walked toward the edge of the lawn. She was wearing jeans rolled at the ankles and a loose linen blouse, sleeves halfway up her forearms. Casual, but somehow commanding. Every step was measured, precise, like she knew the effect she had on people, even on guys like me who weren't supposed to notice. You're huffing and puffing out here, she said, tilting her head with a half smirk. Show me your stamina. I blinked. My stomach did a weird twist. I should have laughed it off, maybe said something joking. But her eyes stayed locked on mine, and for a moment, the world narrowed down to the space between us, the scent of fresh-cut grass hanging heavy in the air. Her tone wasn't flirtatious exactly. It wasn't demanding. It was expectant, like she was seeing whether I could rise to whatever unspoken challenge she'd thrown my way. Sure, I muttered, suddenly self-conscious about how little stamina I actually had. She didn't answer. She just walked closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and stood at the edge of the driveway. I noticed the small lines at the corners of her eyes when she squinted against the sun. They made her look younger and older all at once, like she'd lived a full life, but hadn't stopped noticing little things along the way. I wanted to say something clever, maybe ask why she was so interested in a random neighbor's lawn chores. But the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, mower idling, feeling the heat on my neck and the pull of her presence. There was a pause, just long enough that I started to worry I'd said something wrong, that she might laugh and leave. Instead, she picked up a glass of iced tea from the little table on her porch and handed it to me without a word. Here, she said, and the gesture was simple, almost casual, but it was deliberate. I took it, fumbling slightly with the condensation on the glass, and our fingers brushed for a split second. That brief, electric contact made my chest tighten. She stepped back then, letting the silence stretch between us, eyes flicking over the mower, over me, as though cataloging every detail without judgment. And just as quickly, she turned and walked back inside, leaving the screen door ajar. I set the glass down on the grass, watching her retreating figure, heart still thumping like I'd run a sprint. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had said, "Show me your stamina," about how the light had caught her hair, about the warmth of her hand. Something about her lingered in the air long after she'd gone. And I knew, even as I resumed mowing, that I'd be thinking about that glance, that pause, for a long time. I didn't expect to see her again that afternoon, but a text from her had popped up on my phone. "Can you help me with the shelf in the garage? It's heavier than I thought." Something about the way she phrased it made me hesitate, then nod even though she couldn't see me. When I arrived, she was crouched on the floor, measuring a crooked stack of boxes. The garage smelled faintly of oil and dust, a mix that somehow felt intimate rather than messy. She glanced up when I stepped in, and for a heartbeat, her guarded expression flickered into something softer, maybe relief. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice quieter than I remembered. There was a hint of fatigue in it, a softness that didn't reach her eyes at first. She brushed a hand through her hair, leaving a stray silver strand loose against her cheek. I noticed it, the way it caught the afternoon light, and my stomach twisted. We lifted the shelf together, moving it toward the wall. I kept my eyes on her hands, strong, capable hands, with faint lines from years of work, gripping the wood with careful precision. She caught me staring and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile, looking away quickly. "I don't need you to hover," she said, half laughing, but the sound was fragile, like it could shatter if I looked too long. I stayed close, just enough to help steady the shelf. Every time our hands brushed, a small shock ran up my arm, though she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and pretended not to. She muttered under her breath about the weight, and I caught the brief slump of her shoulders, the tight line around her mouth. Even confident women had moments like this, I thought, when the world felt heavier than usual. Okay, almost there, she said, finally letting out a breath. She leaned against the wall for a moment, folding her arms, staring at the shelf as if it were the hardest puzzle in the world. I wanted to ask her what was on her mind, but something in her silence told me she wasn't ready to talk. I just stood there, noticing the small things, the faint laugh lines at the corner of her eyes, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, how tired she looked despite the casual strength she carried. I wanted to reach out, to tell her she didn't have to hide it from me, but I didn't. Instead, I offered a hand to steady her when the shelf wobbled. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a fraction of a second, the wall she'd built around herself cracked. Her lips parted, maybe to say something, maybe just to breathe. I had my gaze, careful, not pressing. "Thanks," she whispered, and it wasn't just for the shelf. Her eyes flicked away quickly, but the weight of that moment lingered between us, a subtle pull I couldn't ignore. I realized I'd been holding my breath without noticing. There was something about the quiet, about the shared effort, that made the air between us heavier than it had any right to be. And as I backed away, letting her catch her balance, I couldn't stop thinking about the softness in her voice, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers lingered on the shelf after I'd let go. That brush of humanity, and maybe something unspoken, had settled deep in my chest, and I knew I'd replay it in my mind for days. This sets up emotional asymmetry. She's guarded, he's observant, the tension is subtle but charged, and the reader feels the slow pull between them. The rain started as I was walking up her driveway, fat drops bouncing off the pavement like they had somewhere urgent to go. She opened the door before I could knock, hair damp, blouse clinging slightly at the sleeves. There was a flash of irritation in her eyes. At the storm, at me being soaked? I wasn't sure, but she didn't move to let me in right away. "Storm came early," I said, shaking off my jacket. "Apparently," she muttered, stepping aside. The garage smelled of rain and wet earth, mixed with the faint aroma of coffee she'd clearly brewed earlier. I noticed the way she rubbed her hands together, a small attempt to warm up, and how her gaze lingered on mine just a second too long. We ended up in her kitchen, standing close to hang up our wet coats. My arm brushed hers, just for a moment, and she didn't move away. Not immediately. Something in her stance, the tilt of her shoulders, the way she was balancing on one foot, made my chest tighten. I wanted to comment, to laugh it off, but I stayed quiet, watching the subtle twitch of her lips. "You always get caught in the rain?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Not usually," I admitted. "Just today, apparently." There was a pause. She leaned against the counter, eyes on the window, tracing the raindrops sliding down the glass. For a moment, the world felt suspended. The storm outside, the quiet warmth inside, the two of us standing a hair's breadth apart. I wanted to reach out, maybe steady her elbow, maybe brush the damp hair from her face, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my place. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and let out a frustrated sigh. I glimpsed a name I didn't recognize flash on the screen. She set it down quickly, muttering, "Not now," and I noticed the brief tension in her jaw, the way she tightened her fingers around the counter. The intrusion was small, but enough to shatter the fragile moment. I realized then how careful I had to be, how close I could get without tipping the balance she maintained so well. I wanted to say something, anything, that might bridge the gap, but I swallowed it, leaving the air between us charged with unspoken words. We ended up washing the coffee mugs together. My hand brushed hers repeatedly, an accidental pattern I couldn't seem to stop. She caught my eye once, a faint blush rising along her cheekbones, and quickly looked away, pretending to scrub a stubborn stain. My heart thudded like it had its own rhythm. I leaned slightly closer, just enough to hear her muttered comment about the rain ruining her evening plans, and she laughed softly, a low sound that made my chest ache. It wasn't a flirtatious laugh, not exactly, but it carried something private, intimate, a secret shared between us in silence. And then, just as I was about to speak, maybe say something I shouldn't, maybe let the air between us shift, I heard a knock at the door. Her brow furrowed. She glanced at me, a mix of annoyance and relief, perhaps, that the spell was broken. I stepped back instinctively, my hand lingering in the air longer than necessary, and the moment collapsed quietly. I watched her open the door, and though the space between us grew suddenly, impossibly large, the warmth of what almost happened, the brush of hands, the shared laugh, the unspoken understanding, lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about it as I left into the rain, wondering if she felt it too, or if it was only me, carrying the tension like a secret I didn't know how to share. The tension here is almost confession, almost touch. External pressure breaks the moment, and the reader feels the charged restraint. I found her sitting on the steps of her porch just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air smelled like damp earth and fading light, the kind of quiet that made you notice everything you'd usually ignore. She didn't look up when I walked onto the porch, and I almost turned back, telling myself I'd come at the wrong time. But something in the tilt of her shoulders made me stay. "You came back," she said finally, voice low, almost hesitant. Yeah, I admitted, unsure why I needed to justify it. My hands itched to do something, anything, but I stayed put, letting the silence stretch. We didn't speak for a while. I could feel her watching me, and I watched her back, noticing the faint lines in her forehead, the small tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the strap of her sandal. She wasn't nervous, not exactly. She was careful, like she was measuring me against some invisible standard. "Do you ever?" she started, then stopped, lips pressing together. She exhaled slowly. "Do you ever feel like we're crossing a line?" My chest tightened. I wanted to laugh, to make light of it, but I didn't. I shook my head slowly, unsure if that made it better or worse. I don't know," I admitted. She turned toward me then, really looked, and the moment froze. Her eyes were raw, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen before. "Because I feel like I should know what this is," she whispered, voice cracking ever so slightly. And I don't. I wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to tell her it was okay, that I didn't know either, but I didn't. I couldn't. I felt the full weight of our proximity, the way it had built over weeks of glances, small touches, unspoken thoughts. It was suffocating and exhilarating all at once. "I don't want this to ruin anything," she said after a long pause, almost as if speaking aloud her fear made it smaller. But the quiver in her voice betrayed her. It wasn't small. It was enormous. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," I whispered, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. I couldn't lie. I couldn't even pretend that I understood the depth of what we'd created in these small, quiet moments. She leaned back, staring at the horizon, and for the first time I saw vulnerability so sharp it made me ache. The silence was thick, almost tactile, like it was pressing against our ribs. My heart thumped too loud, my hands too still. We were too close to ignore it, and yet too far to touch. "I don't even know what I'm hoping for," she admitted finally, and the words hit me harder than any touch ever could. Her voice was soft, almost breaking, and I realized in that moment that she was speaking not to me, but to herself, or maybe to the void that had somehow grown between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but I just nodded, letting the quiet stretch, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. And then, just before the sun disappeared completely, she added, almost to no one at all, "I think. I'm scared of what we might become." This ends on a devastating, vulnerable line, leaving the emotional tension at its peak. It's existential and raw, not romantic yet, but charged with possibility. I was helping her sort through a box of old books in the corner of her living room, the rain still tapping softly against the windows. She had a way of moving through the room, careful, deliberate, like each step had weight beyond the floorboards. I was stacking novels when my hand brushed against something small and folded, a yellowed envelope tucked between two volumes. She noticed immediately. Her eyes flicked to the envelope, and for a moment, I thought she might snatch it away. Instead, she froze, lips parting as if to speak, but catching herself. I didn't ask, didn't touch it. Some silences feel sacred, and this was one of them. Finally, she sighed, the kind of long, slow exhale that carries the weight of years. "That's from a long time ago," she said quietly, voice almost breaking. "I don't even know why I kept it." Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. I watched her, noticing the faint shake of her fingers, the way her jaw tightened. She read it slowly, lips moving, eyes glistening with something she wouldn't name. "It's from him. she admitted finally, almost as if the word itself hurt. My ex. Before everything. Before I realized I could be alone and still feel hollow. She pressed the letter to her chest for a moment, and I felt the air tighten between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but I couldn't. So I just stayed there, letting her emotion fill the room. The rain outside felt louder, pressing against the walls, mirroring the weight in my chest. I never thought I'd see him again, she murmured, eyes fixed on the floor. But sometimes, memories have a way of sneaking back in. Her gaze flicked up then, briefly meeting mine, and I saw it there. The trace of a wound she carried quietly, a shadow behind her confidence. I remembered the photo she'd shown me months ago, of a younger version of herself laughing, carefree, with someone missing now. I wanted to say it out loud, to remind her she hadn't lost everything, that some of the beauty had survived. Instead, I simply handed her a coffee I'd been holding, careful not to break the fragile bubble around her. She accepted it, fingers brushing mine, and there it was again, that spark of something unspoken. Not desire, not exactly, but recognition. Recognition of loss, of longing, of the quiet ache that neither of us had admitted aloud. She crumpled the letter slightly in her hands, then smoothed it back out, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of control. It's strange, she said finally, voice low, almost to herself. How you can carry someone for decades and feel them disappear in an instant. And yet here I am, holding their words like a weight I've never been ready to drop. I wanted to reach across the table, to tell her it was okay, to tell her that holding on didn't make her weak. But I didn't. I only nodded, letting the silence settle, letting her heartbreak exist without interruption. And then, almost without realizing it, she looked up at me, eyes glimmering with a softness I hadn't seen before, and whispered, "Sometimes, I think, I'm ready to let someone in again. Maybe." The words lingered in the air, fragile, almost forbidden, and I felt something shift inside me, a tremor, subtle but seismic, because even the smallest acknowledgement had changed everything. This scene gives a quiet emotional pivot. Her vulnerability is revealed, the dynamic subtly changes, and the tension between them deepens. I arrived at her place late that evening. The sky had darkened to a deep indigo, the streetlights casting pale halos across the driveway. She was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a soft cardigan, knees drawn up slightly, a book resting forgotten on her lap. "You came," she said, voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant, as if asking the question might change the answer. "I did," I replied, and there was no need for explanation. No one else mattered in that moment. We sat on the steps together, the space between us smaller than usual, yet still careful. I could feel her shoulder brush mine, feel the warmth radiating from her. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy with all the unspoken moments we'd shared, the tension, the near confessions, the quiet heartbreak. It had grown into something neither of us could name, but we recognized it without needing words. She leaned slightly toward me, and I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers as she held her cup of tea. I reached over, almost instinctively, and rested my hand lightly against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers brush mine, just a whisper of contact, and the weight of everything seemed to fold into that one simple gesture. "I don't know if we should," she murmured, a faint catch in her throat, though she didn't move away. "I don't either," I admitted. The honesty between us felt heavier than any declaration I could have made. But in that admission was a quiet truth we couldn't escape, that we belonged here, in this fragile, imperfect space, together, if only for this moment. The night settled around us. The street was empty, the air warm but tinged with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, then back to me, and there it was again, that acknowledgement, soft and raw, that said more than any words could. I shifted closer, careful, respectful, letting our knees touch. It was enough. It was everything. I didn't need to say anything. The hand I held, the warmth she shared, the quiet understanding, it all carried the meaning. She let out a small breath, a laugh that was more exhale than amusement, and leaned just enough that our foreheads nearly touched. It wasn't a declaration, wasn't a flourish of romance. It was simple, earned, inevitable. For the first time, I felt the tension that had built over weeks, the longing, the near misses, the unspoken fears. Release. not in fireworks, not in words, but in quiet recognition. We didn't need to label it. We just existed in it. The wind stirred lightly, carrying the smell of the earth and the faint scent of her hair. I felt her relax against me, a subtle surrender, and I matched it, letting the silence fill the space between us. And as the night deepened, with only the gentle hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves, I knew this was enough. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't rushed. It was ours, fragile and honest, and finally, it felt complete. This scene gives the emotional climax and resolution. Subtle, earned intimacy, shared understanding, and a small, human gesture sealing the connection, realistic and quiet. I still remember that night on her porch as clearly as if it were happening now. The quiet, the warmth, the way the air seemed to hold us both in its stillness. It wasn't a fairy tale, not the kind you read about in novels. It was slower, messier, and yet somehow more complete than anything I'd known before. Since then, things between us have changed. I notice her in ways I never expected. The subtle twitch of her lips when she's amused, the soft sigh when she's tired, the way she leans into me for support without a word. And I've changed too. Learning patience, learning how to listen, learning how to hold someone without needing to fill every silence with words. Love, I've realized, isn't always loud. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a shared cup of tea, a hand that brushes yours, a moment of understanding that needs no explanation. With her, it's always been like that. Quiet, grounding, inevitable. We've built a rhythm of our own. I help her with little tasks around the house, and she lets me, sometimes even relies on me, though she'd never admit it outright. There are still awkward pauses, still moments when the past creeps in, but they're lighter now. Shared glances carry more comfort than tension. Small touches carry more meaning than grand gestures ever could. I can't say the road was easy. It wasn't. But there's beauty in the way we've learned to be patient with each other, to respect boundaries, to exist in the same space and feel complete. She taught me that love isn't about perfection. It's about presence, attentiveness, and the courage to stay, even when the world makes it complicated. And I've taught her, maybe nothing, or maybe just that someone can see her fully and still not run. That's enough. That, I think, is enough to make a life feel larger, brighter, and warmer than it ever has. Sometimes, when I pass her on the porch or see her smile over a small, shared joke, I catch myself thinking how strange it is that something so simple, so fragile, can feel so seismic. But it does. Every small moment with her carries weight, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. We're not perfect. We'll still stumble, still misstep. But now, there's a thread between us, a quiet understanding that wasn't there before. And that's what makes every look, every brush of hands, every shared silence matter. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?